Hey guys, we are back talking about Survivor 45, and it is that time of the season where we'll be going through our jury scenarios, going through each final three scenario based on how likely I think it is to happen, and forecasting what I think would happen if that scenario were to take place. And I found this to be a pretty fun process, and obviously there's plenty to break down here. But at the time of recording, there are 5 players still in the game, those being Austin, Dee, Jake, Julie, and Katurah. And it's no secret at this point that I think Dee is by far the most likely person to win based off her edit. And I feel like that's reflected in this video, where I feel like a lot of the more likely scenarios are ones that not only have Dee in them, but also have Dee in a spot to actually win the game. So I feel like that's reflected there. I feel like she's played a pretty dominant game for the most part. Now, there are some worries about her perception, which we'll be talking about more when we get to the actual jurors. But I feel like by the end, those should be rectified enough for her to actually win the game. Then we have Julie, who I think is the second biggest jury threat. I feel like she's also seen as a pretty big threat, as we've seen across the show. That's actually a big reason why she's been targeted these last couple rounds. And I think looking at the exit interviews, I think there's some credence to that, where we've seen Julie like playing pretty actively, where while it hasn't been on the show, she has been building some final three alliances with some of the jurors here, which I think could lead to her actually being taken seriously as she gets towards the end. People like a Drew, people like a Kendra could see her as playing a lot harder than people like a Dee, to where they'll probably be more likely to give their votes to her by the end of it. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think Julie's likely to get towards the end based off her edit either, and also the fact that this active gameplay has not been showcased more in the show is probably a red flag that she's not going to get there. But I think when we're looking at the possible scenarios, I think we had to consider that. So I actually think Julie is a somewhat likely contender as well. Then you have Austin, who I think is in an interesting spot here. He obviously has two pretty close allies in Drew and Emily on the jury. You also have Dee, who he has a bit of a showmance with at this point. And you even have some people like Caleb and Kelly who have talked about him in their exit interviews as being a big threat and someone who they've kind of underestimated. Though that was obviously earlier in the game, and it's not entirely sure how he's going to stack up against Dee or Julie by the end of it, though we'll get to that more soon. Then we have Katurah, who, like Austin, will also have some close allies on the jury, people like Kelly and Kendra, although I'm not entirely sure how much they're really going to respect her game by the end of it, where they didn't really talk much about Katurah's game in their exit interviews. And I feel like based on the way the game is played out, I'm not entirely sure if someone like a Kelly is going to respect Katurah's game all the way. Now, I still think there's a chance that she could throw a vote for Katurah in certain situations, but I don't think they're going to see Katurah as the best player on the season, and I think they're going to be basing their vote off that. So I feel like Katurah is kind of in a rocky spot coming into this last couple of rounds, but you never know. And then there's Jake, who I don't think is winning the season at all. I feel like he's the smallest jury threat here. I feel like the jury's not really going to respect his game. Now, that's not to say people don't like Jake per se. I feel like Kendra is obviously someone who liked him out there. I feel like people like Jake, but I feel like that's not going to translate to giving him their jury vote by the end of it. And I think that's also reflected in the exit interviews, where I don't think anyone really spoke positively about Jake's game. And I feel like that's just going to play out by the end of it. And then we move over to the jury, where we currently have 6 people on the jury, those being Caleb, Kelly, Kendra, Bruce, Emily, and Drew voted out at the last tribal. And again, I think coming into it, I feel like they're probably going to be focused on game, at least more so than on Survivor UK. And obviously, there are some key relationships here on the jury. You have Katurah having some close allies in Kelly and Kendra. You have Austin having some close relationships in Drew and Emily here. You also have Bruce, who obviously had a major rivalry with Katurah during the season, but also talked very highly of Julie during his exit interview, so I feel like that'll be a factor. There's obviously a lot to break down, but I feel like a big thing that will factor into this jury, particularly in certain situations, is how they end up perceiving their gains by the end of it. Now, on paper, you'd think that Dee would be the biggest threat due to people talking at points about her being a big threat and obviously needing to get her out. And obviously, she has played a very solid game, being in the majority alliance for a lot of it. But I think Julie could also be in a spot to get a lot of that credit in the situations where they're both at the end together. Where Drew in particular has talked very highly of Julie's game in his exit interview, talking about how he's made all these final 3 deals with various people like Kendra and Bruce. I feel like that'll play a factor if Julie gets towards the end, to where Julie could be seen as the biggest threat in that case. Now, obviously, based on my power rankings and the edit, I don't think Julie's getting towards the end. But I feel like in this situations where Dee and Julie are at the end together, I think a lot of it will come down to whether people will be able to sell their games to each other. Will Dee be able to sell her game to the jury in a way that makes her come off as the better player there? Or will people like a Drew convince people like an Austin and an Emily, who may be on the jury, to give their votes to Julie for Julie being the more active player of the Rebas? So I think that'll be a big factor as well. And I think that'll define a lot of these jury scenarios. So I think that's where I'm standing coming into this video in terms of how I think the jury vote will play out. But obviously, there are 10 final 3 scenarios to break down, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 10, the final 3 scenario I believe is the least likely to happen is Austin versus Julie versus Katurah. And the main reason that I had this scenario at the bottom is that it has neither Dee nor Jake on there, where obviously I think Dee's the most likely winner based off the edit, and I think Jake is someone who is particularly likely to get towards the end as a losing finalist. And while I've talked about Julie as a potential threat, I think she's unlikely to get towards the end either. So I feel like mixing those together, I feel like this is the least likely scenario to happen based off the edit, and it would kind of surprise me if this is the final 3 that we get. Now, if it were to happen, I think it would kind of be up for grabs, though I think Julie would pull it out by the end of it. Where first up, I think Julie would get the lock votes of Bruce and Drew, where even though Drew was closer to Austin throughout a lot of the season, I think he would see Julie as a better player based on the way that he's talked about her game. I think Austin would get some lock votes in Dee and Jake. Then you have Kelly and Kendra, who could vote for Katurah if they really wanted to, though I think they lean Julie over Austin. And I think at that point, it would give Julie 4 votes. She just needs 1 more to win. And I think it would come down to Caleb and Emily, where obviously they were very close on the island. Emily in particular was closer to Austin throughout the game than Julie, though I could see Drew convincing her to vote for Julie based off game, but you never know. And then you have Caleb, who I just don't really know as much about. I feel like he talked more highly of Austin in his exit interview, but obviously that was way far back. I think if he sees like how the rest of the game played out with Julie playing an idol to save herself, sort of similar to how he saved himself. Plus, if Emily's on Drew's side and voting for Julie, I think that could also pull in Caleb to vote for Julie there. So I think Julie would have the advantage by the end of it, though there are definitely votes up for grads. But again, I feel like based off the edit and the people that are there, I feel like it's the least likely to happen, which is why I have it here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have a very similar scenario, just swapping out one person. And here we have Austin versus Jake versus Julie. And again, I feel like this one's a bit more likely as it at least has Jake in there, as I feel like Jake's more likely to squeeze his way towards the end. Plus, I think Katurah is a bit more likely to not get there due to her potentially losing in fire. But I still feel like this one's unlikely as, again, I feel like the edit is leaning towards a D win. So for her to not get there while Julie does would seem a bit unlikely in my eyes. Now, if it were to happen, I think this would also lead to a Julie win. Mind you, I think there is less locked votes than the previous scenario, where I think Julie would have the locked votes of Kelly, Kendra, Bruce, and Drew there. That's 4 votes. That's already enough to tie. I think Austin would probably get the locked vote of Dee in this situation. And again, at that point, I feel like a lot of it comes down to Caleb, Emily, and Katurah here. Now, I'm not entirely sure where Katurah lands here, as I'm not entirely sure what her relationships are with these people. Though if I had to suspect, considering that Kelly and Kendra are also voting for Julie in this scenario, I could also see Katurah just voting for Julie there. That would give Julie the outright win, though it wouldn't shock me if she voted for Austin either. And again, sort of similar with the previous scenario, you have Caleb and Emily, who could go either way, though I could see them being open to persuasion, depending on certain people being able to get to them. So I think this would still lead to a Julie win, but considering the edit, I feel like it's unlikely to happen, which is why it's here number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have another scenario that does not have D in it, but here we have Jake versus Julie versus Katurah. And again, I feel like this is largely a reflection of my confidence in Dee winning the game, and my confidence in Julie not getting to the end. As again, this is another pretty far-fetched situation. Now, yes, it does have Jake in there, so that I think that boosts it to a degree. And I could see a world where Katurah is able to win fire against like a Dee, for example, and is able to squeeze her way to the end because of that. But again, I don't think this one's super likely either. But if it were to happen, I think Julie would win pretty handily here, where I feel like the only votes that Katurah could get is Kelly and Kendra, sort of as sympathy votes, but you never know. Even then, they could still vote for Julie anyway. And I think Jake gets 0 votes here, as usual. So again, I think this would lead to a pretty certain Julie win. But again, I feel like it's unlikely to happen, which is why it's here number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and we have the highest ranked scenario that does not have D in it. And here we have Austin versus Jake versus Katurah. And I feel like if D is not the winner of the season, this is probably the most likely scenario, where obviously it would involve Julie and D being cut along the way. Again, Julie being someone I don't think is getting towards the end. And I feel like if this is a surprise Katurah or Austin win, I feel like this is probably the way that would play out, where obviously Julie would probably go at 5, and then D loses the fire making challenge at 4, and we get this scenario. And I think if this scenario were to happen, I have it as an Austin win, though I think Katurah gets some votes. Where first up, I think Katurah probably gets the votes of Kelly and Kendra in this scenario, but I think Austin gets the remaining votes. As again, I feel like while Katurah could have this surprise run towards the end, I'm not entirely sure how much this jury is really going to respect Katurah's game by the end of there, where obviously they know that Reba has been the dominant force for a lot of the game, and I feel like if neither D nor Julie are there, I feel like Austin's the next most likely person to inherit the credit for that. And I feel like the other two have not done enough to really win over this jury. So I feel like because of that, this will probably lead to an Austin win, which, as I said in my power ranking, Austin's probably not winning this season. And because of that, I do have this here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and from this point on, all the other scenarios have D in there, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 6, and this was kind of a weird one, I did have to think about this one a little bit, but I actually have Austin versus D versus Julie. And I had this one this low for a few reasons. One is that it does not have Jake in there. I feel like Jake's probably one of the more likely people to get towards the end, so I feel like that knocks it down. But I also think that Dee's unlikely to get to the end with both Austin and Julie, where obviously they're her two closest allies, and on paper you'd think that she would want to get towards the end with them. But at the same time, we did get that confessional from Dee in the last episode about her needing to put her emotions aside. And I think with that, that could be set up to Dee recognizing that she needs to cut Julie before the end. And I feel like with Julie seeming likely to be cut before the end, I feel like that'll lead to Dee recognizing that she feels like it'll be better for her to get to the end with Austin and one of Jake or Katurah to ensure her win at the end. And I think because of that, I feel like it's unlikely Dee will actually want to make this suboptimal move, which this scenario would require. Though, interestingly, if this scenario were to happen, I think D would still have a serious shot of winning, though it would probably be close. Where I think first up, I think D gets the lot votes of Kelly, Kendra, Jake, and Katurah. That's already enough to tie, but obviously that's not enough. She needs at least one more vote, or for someone to throw their vote onto Austin to ensure her win. Now, I think first up, Julie would get the lot votes of Bruce. I think Drew's a likely Julie vote, though I think that one could be up for grabs if Dee is able to effectively sell her game. As I feel like something that came out in Drew's exit interview is that he doesn't recognize the intentionality of Dee's game, where he talks about during the final 7, where he knew that Dee was going to leak the plan to Julie. However, he talks about it as if Dee did it by accident, and that was his perception. He didn't realize at the time that Dee had done this on purpose to try to save Julie here. And because of that, I'm not entirely sure if Drew fully recognizes the full extent of Dee's game. Whereas I feel like if Dee is able to really convey that through her final tribal performance, I think that could potentially flip Drew into Dee's favor there. And obviously that would give Dee to win. But for this forecast, I am giving this vote to Julie, as I think that's his current perception on things. And then beyond that, I think it comes down to Caleb and Emily here, where again, they're probably split between Austin and Julie. I think they would recognize that the vote would be close between Dee and Julie, which would incentivize them to lean towards Julie. But again, if Dee is able to convince Drew that she was playing actively and that she is also worthy of respect, I think that could flip all of those votes to where it would instead turn into a 7-1 Dee victory. So I think this is actually a pretty interesting scenario that could go a number of different ways here. And again, it could actually still lead to a D win by the end of it. But again, I feel like based off the edit, I think it is leaning towards Julie being cut before the end. And I think it would probably prop up D if she's able to actually make this decision and cut Julie by the end. And that's why I had this scenario here at number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we have a similar scenario, just swapping out one person. And here we have Dee versus Julie versus Katurah here. Again, very similar to the earlier scenario, just swapping out Austin for Katurah. I still think this one's less likely though, as it doesn't have Jake in there, as I feel like that's been more likely based off the edit. But again, there's still a possibility of it happening. And I think if it were to happen, I think it's very similar to the scenario we just talked about here, where you're just swapping out Austin for Katurah here, where I think Austin's a lock vote for D here on the jury. Obviously, you have the question of Kelly and Kendra and whether they'll throw a vote into Katurah as a sympathy vote. But again, I feel like if they recognize the vote could be close, I think they'll probably side with D over Julie in this case. And at that point, it comes down to the Drew, Caleb, and Emily group, where obviously they could recognize Julie's game and through that tie up the vote for Julie, or if Kelly and Kendra vote for Katurah, could just outright give Julie the win, or they could recognize Dee's game if she's able to sell out a final tribal, and through that they vote for Dee, which would ensure a Dee victory either way. Again, this one's actually a bit more interesting, mainly due to Kelly and Kendra potentially voting for Katurah, though I think they'll probably recognize the stakes and probably stick with one of Dee or Julie. But again, I feel like this scenario is also unlikely to happen as it has Julie in there. So I feel like for that reason, I have it here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and we have the highest ranked scenario, which has Julie in it. And here we have Dee versus Jake versus Julie. And again, this one's the highest because it has both Dee and Jake in there, which realistically I could see happening, particularly if Dee is like enamored by Julie to the point where she cuts Austin over her, which would be kind of disappointing. But again, you never know. And I think in this scenario, it'd be very similar to the ones we already talked about here. I think Dee would have some lock votes in Kelly, Kendra, Austin, and Katurah here, 4 votes. I think Julie still gets that lock vote in Bruce. And again, same people deciding the game in Drew, Emily, and Caleb here, where again, you never know what will happen here. But I think in the scenario where Dee is unable to take out Julie, I think that'll probably be a bigger knock at the end of the day. But again, I feel like these scenarios are all relatively similar, but without Julie being the super likely person to get towards the end. That's why I do have it lower, and it is here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and I feel like this scenario is also kind of interesting, though I'm very much on the fence about it. And here we have Austin versus Dee versus Katurah. And I think the tough thing about this scenario is that it doesn't have Jake in there. I feel like Jake's more likely to get towards the end than Katurah, and through that, I am definitely questioning it to a degree. But at the same time, I think without Julie there, and obviously with Dee there, along with Austin, I think there's a chance that could happen where, let's say, Dee is able to come around to cutting Julie at 5, and then at 4, like you get that fire making challenge where Katurah is able to pull it out, taking out Jake. I think that is a somewhat reasonable possibility, though I'm not entirely sure about it. And I think if this scenario were to happen, I think Dee would have the advantage here, though Austin could get some votes, and I think Katurah could also get some votes here. Where first up, I think Dee would get the lock votes of Bruce, Jake, and Julie. I think Austin could get the votes of Emily and Drew, where I'm not entirely sure about that either. Again, Final Travel could play a huge factor in that, also how they have reacted to the end game. But for this scenario, I'll just say that Austin gets those votes. You obviously have Katurah, which could be interesting. She could siphon some votes from Kelly and Kendra. And then you have Caleb, who, again, I'm very much on the fence about. I think he could go either way in this scenario. Again, for the scenario, I'll say he leans Austin here, but even then, that's not entirely secure. So I think Dee actually has quite the upper hand here in terms of actually getting votes to actually win. And while Austin would get some votes in this scenario, I think they're not entirely secure. I don't think they're as secure as Dee's votes here. So for all I know, this could actually be a landslide Dee victory. But again, I'm giving these people the benefit of the doubt. But again, I feel like this scenario, while somewhat possible, it's probably not the one that I think is the most likely, which is why it's here number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and I feel like based off everything I've said in terms of the edit, I feel like these are the 2 most likely Final 3 scenarios to happen, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 2, I did decide to go with Dee versus Jake versus Katurah. And I think this is definitely an interesting scenario to play out here. Now, I think the path there is probably interesting, where I think more than likely what happens is Julie wins Final 5 immunity. That causes the target to turn towards Austin. Maybe Jake plays his idol there to ensure that it happens. And I think that kind of leaves Dee in a very weird spot. She probably wins Final Four immunity, puts Julie and Katurah into fire, and then probably Katurah wins that fire making challenge, sending up Julie in fourth. I think that's probably a reasonable path for that to happen, though I think in terms of putting Dee on a winner ranking, that's probably not ideal. Though if this scenario were to happen, I think this would be a very decisive Dee victory here, where I think there's a very good chance Dee could just outright win unanimously here, where I feel like she would have the locked votes of Caleb, Bruce, Emily, Drew, Austin, and Julie. That's already enough to win. The one variable in all this is whether Kelly and Kendra throw sympathy votes onto Katurah, or if they give her credit for winning the fire making challenge. Though even then, I could still see them voting for Dee to make it a unanimous Dee win, which would be pretty impressive from a jury standpoint. But again, I feel like I'm still kind of conflicted over whether this is actually the most likely scenario here. I think it comes down to whether Katurah or Austin are being propped up as the people that get towards the end, or if Katurah is going to come up short. So I feel like that's definitely something to factor in here, but I still give some credence to the scenario possibly happening, which is why it's here at number 2. And now at number 1, the final 3 scenario I believe is the most likely to happen is Austin versus Dee versus Jake. And I think a lot of this was informed by the last episode, where we got that contrast between Austin and Dee in terms of how they handled similar situations, which I think could be an interesting contrast in terms of Final Tribal. I think Dee more than likely gets towards the end with one of her closest allies between Austin and Julie, of which I think she's more likely to take Austin to the end. And plus, this scenario has Jake in there, which I think is likely there. And I think it also opens it up for Katurah to lose Final Four fire making, which is something that I alluded to a couple episodes ago. It wouldn't shock me if that were to happen. And I think if it were to happen, it would lead to a decisive Dee victory here, where I think she gets the locked votes of Kelly, Kendra, Bruce, Julie, and Katurah. That's already enough to win. The question is, what do Caleb, Emily, and Drew do? Do they give their votes to Austin, or do they vote for Dee to make it unanimous? Again, it could go either way, but it doesn't really matter. Dee still ends up winning this scenario. Again, I think there's definitely a debate over whether this scenario is the most likely, or if I'm just reading too much into it and we get a Dee, Jake, Katurah Final 3 instead. For this video, I'm going to stick to my guns based on my power ranking and say that this is probably the Final 3 based off the setup we got from the last episode. And because of that, I do have it here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Now, on Wednesday night, the night of the Survivor 45 finale, I'll be doing a live stream where you'll be able to see my reaction to the events in real time, so you can look forward to that. After the season is over, I'll be doing my player ranking and reviews, so you can look forward to those. Same thing with Survivor UK once that wraps up, so you can look forward to that. And I also have an amazing Race 35 team ranking coming out not too long from now. So again, a lot of videos coming out in not a lot of time. I am on Patreon now, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.